Smith of DPS Legal Counsel. Welcome to today's video and podcast episode of Legal Scrubs. Today I want to talk about selling a dental practice and what you can expect when you get around to starting to structure the sale of your practice. Essentially, there are two types of transactions that you can have when you sell your practice. One is sometimes called a stock sale, even though you may have an LLC rather than a corporation. And that a stock sale or a sale of your LLC interest is essentially the sale of the ownership interest in the entire practice rather than a sale of the individual underlying assets. It's a top tier kind of sale in which you're selling the ownership of the business based on the entity in which it operates, either selling the corporate stock or selling the LLC interest to your buyer. The other type of transaction is an asset sale in which you are selling essentially the underlying assets of the business directly to the buyer. The buyer is not buying your practice entity, it's buying the assets of the practice from you. Now, most of the time, sales are going to be structured as an asset sale, and that is because buyers are typically concerned and unwilling, generally, to buy the underlying or to buy the entity itself because of a fear of taking on the liabilities of that entity. So, for example, if you had a buyer who was going to buy your practice, they probably are not going to want to buy your corporate stock or your LLC interest in your entity because they may be concerned about some unknown potential lawsuit against your entity for malpractice or for some other reason, and they don't want to take on the risk of that liability, so they don't want to buy the entity itself. So what they want to do, and typically what you will see, is a sale of the underlying assets from the seller to the buyer. Now, when you sell assets, each asset is slightly different than the other assets that are being sold. There are different classes of assets. So you have, in a dental practice, you would have some inventory of items, you would have some furniture, you would have some fixtures, you would have dental equipment, and then you have some intangible assets, such as your practice's goodwill. And so when you get to the point of trying to work out an asset purchase agreement with your buyer, you're going to have an understanding and an agreement as to how much of the purchase price is allocated to each particular class of assets. And in fact, in a typical asset purchase agreement, there is going to be a provision that is called asset allocation or something like that, in which the buyer and the seller agree on the allocation of a certain part of the purchase price to each class of assets. So, for example, if you're selling your practice for, let's just say, $1 million, you may allocate, based on the fair market value of the assets, you may allocate $100,000 to furniture, you may allocate $100,000 to equipment, you may allocate $100,000 to inventory, and the rest may go to goodwill, or what is the value, the ongoing going concern value of the practice apart from its hard assets. Now, it's important to realize that each particular class of assets, each asset that's being sold is going to have a different tax consequence to you as the seller. So if you sell inventory, things that you would be making available for sale directly to customers, the sale of those assets is going to be taxed generally at ordinary income tax rates, which are higher than capital gains rates. If you're selling equipment that has been depreciated, some part of the purchase price equal to the amount that you've depreciated that basis in your equipment is going to be taxed at ordinary income tax rates. Now, intangible assets like goodwill are going to be taxed at a lower capital gains rate. And so there's some tension between the buyer and the seller as to how you allocate the purchase price. sellers are going to want to allocate more to capital gains types of assets. Buyers are going to want to allocate value to assets that they can expense more quickly, maybe currently, when they buy the practice, rather than having to amortize the value or over a period of time, which they would have to do with for example, intangible asset of goodwill. So there's some tension there. But as a seller, you're going to want to allocate as much as you reasonably can, and obviously based on your agreement with your buyer, you're going to want to allocate as much as you can to goodwill and other assets that are capital assets that are going to produce a lower tax bill for you on the sale of your practice. When you do enter into an asset purchase agreement with your buyer, you are going to want to have an agreed upon allocation of the assets and the value, the portion of the purchase price that goes to certain classes of assets, because when you each file your tax returns for the year in which the sale takes place, you need to be consistent, seller and buyer, with how much of the purchase price was allocated to each class of assets. And in fact, there's an IRS form that you will want to enter into in connection with your practice sale that's going to allocate and the purchase price and allow you both to be consistent in how you allocate the purchase price. Okay, there's a lot to be done when you sell a practice, but one of the things you don't want to lose sight of is asset value, asset price allocation, and how it affects the tax consequences to the buyer and to the seller. All right, I hope that helps. We'll see you next time.